Welcome back, beautiful and amazing human beings. This is Luke Radowski of WeAreChange.org, and in this video, we are going to be talking about the shroom boom. Yes, this is going to be a very interesting video as we're going to delve into cannabis legalization, which some early studies and research is proving could help and prevent the sickness that is going around. Of course, there's a lot to talk about what is happening in the industry, what is happening with legalizations, its effects on society, which is also leading to a very important conversation about psychedelics. And to talk about that, plus a lot more, we have George Anstey. He is the CEO of Pharmadelic. He is an insider in the industry who, of course, has his pulse on exactly what is happening. Now, George, we've been connected through, of course, a mutual friend of ours, and I was wondering, for the people who don't know you and don't know your company that is based off in the British Virgin Islands, if I'm correct, tell us about yourself and your company, please.
Sure. Okay. So I'm in British Columbia, which is in Canada. I got my start in the cannabis industry, about 10 years ago. I've been through the startup ringer a number of times. And what really sort of cued my interest leading into the psychedelic boom was working with a company called Broken Coast Cannabis some years ago. They were a fantastic success story of the Canadian cannabis industry. I got hired as an early stage employee with Broken Coast Cannabis here on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Very, very early on. I think I was the 8th or 9th employee, the 3rd or 4th security cleared person. And they started with very modest beginnings. It was very much a family operation. And they grew it into a fantastic success story and recently got acquired for $250 million. So, seeing that from the beginning, building it up one brick at a time and seeing the potential really shaped my perception of what's possible in entrepreneurial settings and especially in emerging industries. So after leaving Broken Coast and after seeing their buyout, I was really keen to start working on psychedelics in particular because at that point it seemed obvious to me, at least, that psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, was the next domino to fall. So that was some years ago. That was about 3 years ago now that I started working on it with our first researchers, and that research effort morphed into what is now Pharmadelic, where I sit as CEO. So the reason for being a Pharmadelic is an IP engine. So we're an intellectual property factory. So the whole point is that we're developing intellectual property as it applies to psychedelic compound production in such a way that it will interface and it be desirable for acquisition for existing pharmaceutical interests. So we're kind of Big Pharma's best friend when it comes to psychedelic production. So we're all focused on R&D right now and developing the production methods. And we'll be porting those production methods, as you mentioned, down into jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, where the regulatory hurdles are smaller, to put it simply.
That's really interesting. If I could just say, because Big Pharma doesn't really have an accolade towards natural substances that do help people. And if you were talking just a few years ago, I remember early on it being almost an impossible task to even get through marijuana legalization. And we have to admit, there was kind of a big revolution that did happen that transformed our lives. And when we look at legalization, we are really seeing something that has had a tremendous effect since, of course, the authorities stopped arresting and throwing people in jail and ruining their lives for using a natural chemical that some people use for medicine. It's just absolutely absurd what happened. It's still happening in some jurisdictions, but I kind of wanted to get your, first of all, before we talk about exactly what even you do on a greater level, I wanted to kind of get your pulse since you're in this field. What's the stage of legalization? We know some states have legalized, some states are still arresting people. Is there even still a debate left? Because looking at the data, especially in Colorado, especially in the Netherlands, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, that I largely agree with what you just said there. So I should head this off by saying no one has a crystal ball. I certainly don't, and I think it's just not possible to predict which states are going to decriminalize or legalize first. However, we can look to cities like Santa Cruz, Oakland, Denver, where at a city level, there's been efforts to decriminalize within their own city jurisdiction. And this kind of sets the table for a meaningful discussion at the state level. So again, like it's going to be very difficult to predict. But if we're taking guesses, I think we can look and trace out how the decriminalization and legalization efforts unfolded for cannabis in the United States as a close analogy. So again, like no crystal ball here, but if we were going to take a guess, I would say that given that California and Colorado were really leading the charge for decriminalization and legalization at a state level for cannabis, I think it's reasonable that we're to expect to see a similar efforts made on the psychedelic side.
I mean, that's a very important context to bring up here, because ever since, the war on drugs were fought, ever since Richard Nixon even made it illegal to scientifically study psychedelics and look into psychedelics, that has had a tremendous effect that has severely hurt a lot of people that could have benefited from some of the real legitimate studies and research into it. And he pretty much outlawed basic information from being provided to you that again, there has been a lot of studies showing that actually do help. How do you see this kind of unfolding, this battle? Because I still believe there is kind of this stigma with psychedelics, not as much as marijuana anymore, but we also have to remember there was a stigma against marijuana just a few years ago. There's a lot of disinformation about marijuana and the war on drugs a few years ago. Now I'm seeing a very similar stigma with psychedelics. How do you see this kind of unfolding from here, especially with big pharma, especially with the medical community slowly opening up its door and kind of opening up Pandora's box, if I would say?
Totally. So there's a couple things there. So forgive me if you have to get me back on track, but let's start unpacking that. So first of all, yes, these substances and compounds have been out of reach for at least for clinicians and patients for decades. And that, in my opinion, is an injustice. And frankly, it's my opinion that they should have never been made illegal to start with. Certainly regulated, absolutely regulated, tightly controlled, absolutely. But to make it illegal, like I said, it just takes tools out of the hands of clinicians and their patients. And you mentioned taboo. You mentioned I can't remember the exact words you'd used, but the stigma, I think was the word you used. The stigma.
Yes.
Yeah. So speaking of stigma, yes, there is stigma being relieved off of natural substances and potential treatments like psychedelics or herbal treatments like cannabis. Another item that has traditionally had a lot of stigma, a lot of taboo, that is finally starting to lift is mental health. It was the norm for generations and generations that, either it was sort of a denial thing that, oh, well, no, mental health happens to other people. Like I'm healthy, I'm not sick, like it's not me. Or even just, maybe there's an understanding of it, but an unwillingness to actually discuss it. And so then that created a lot of stigma because it was very uncomfortable for people to talk about mental health items. That is starting to change. And I think a lot of that at a societal level can be attributed to the lockdown that we're in right now, where, people that I know, perhaps people that are coming out and saying like, look, like being stuck in my apartment every day, all day is affecting my mental health and I'm here to talk about it. And there's sort of this critical mass of people that have experienced the same thing at the same time, where now it's a conversation piece. And we've got the small edge of the wedge in the door to really start to unpack this and start addressing underlying causes and underlying conditions related to mental health. So I would like to keep it in that context wherever possible, that, this is a tool. What we're working on ultimately will become tools in the hands of clinicians and treatment options for folks that are, in touching to or adjacent to mental health items, perhaps even for themselves. So I think at this point, it's not such a taboo thing anymore to have the discussion to say, hey, like, members of my family, close friends, people that I work with are struggling with mental health. This isn't something that is scary to talk about anymore. And that's really what I'm excited for, that, we can start to address things that have real potential for change in society and actually helping people. And that's really what gets me excited. I mean, the markets are one thing, and building businesses is one thing. Like, like I said before, that's my mindset is from a building perspective. And all my ventures, I've had a one brick at a time mentality to it. But more generally, what gets me excited is the potential to change society. And, if this is an avenue to do so with positive downstream effects, I'm going to keep at it. I'm going to keep building it. So yep. that's I apologize, it's a little long-winded. You might need to get me back on track there. But in summation, in terms of taboo, both from a substance side and from a mental health side, people are starting to open up. Society is opening up, and this is the opportunity to make change. And that's what gets me excited.
Yeah, a couple of points I wanted to talk about. Even Dr. Fauci came out recently, shocked a lot of people, and said staying inside will cause irreversible damage. Now, we don't have any official data, but some of the early data we're getting is that suicide hotlines, mental health issues are skyrocketing towards grand proportions that we haven't seen before. And when we look at economic downturn, which definitely the markets suggest that we're heading into, you see a good correlation with, of course, illnesses that, by the way, in the 1950s and 60s, Harvard professors and neurosurgeons were looking into with psychedelics as far as treating addictions, depression, anxiety, microdosing. Now, it doesn't work with everyone. Everyone is a unique case. Your microbiome in your gut is different. Your brain chemistry is different than somebody else. No one is normal. But just even the research from it alone was banned, and that's absolutely ridiculous. Some of that research is opening up. There have been new developments in the industry, and I wanted to talk to you specifically. What are some of the developments, some of the studies, some of the research, the data, the information, the truth that's coming out there right now that has you most excited there?
Sure. So, I mean, I'm just going to echo a little bit of what I've already said, but we'll see if we can dig into it a little bit further. But the thing that gets me most excited for recent developments in the psychedelic space is just its application, as I said, to mental health. Societally, we've been very hesitant to open this discussion in previous generations. It's now on the table, whether we like it or not. A lot of people all at once are struggling with mental health, and if these class of compounds is something that clinicians believe are worth investigating, we're here to support them.
Now, I'm also hearing that your business also has this particular technology that is able to grow something that usually took 70 days to 3 days. Is this like GMO Monsanto wheat? What are we talking about here? Could you explain to us some of the things that you do, especially in the kind of growing industry?
Yeah, so I need to give that a bit of context. This is actually a question that, rightly so, comes up very often because it is new. It's something that requires a bit of context and So where should we start?
Tell us exactly what this technology is.
Okay. So let's start with biosynthesis. Are you familiar with biosynthesis?
No, not at all.
Okay. So So what we've done is, in short, we've taken several different types of yeast, and we've taught them how to produce psilocybin. There's other companies that are doing similar things with yeast, where they're teaching yeast how to produce cannabinoids like CBD or THC. You might have heard some news about companies growing THC using yeast. We're doing that, but with psilocybin. So we've done genetic modifications, as you mentioned, to yeast, so that it's, as in due course of its metabolism, it produces psilocybin. So that by itself is super cool. Like many other people in my generation, grew up with Bill Nye. I've always really enjoyed learning and engaging with scientific discovery, and this is no exception. You know, this is just the coolest thing that that I've ever been involved in, frankly, and it's really exciting. So to the timescale that you alluded to there, yes, this technology does hold the potential to drastically reduce the production time for psilocybin, because but we're not doing it in the mushroom. Like we're producing psilocybin, we're growing psilocybin without growing mushrooms. So doing the mushrooms is going to take you between 8 and 10 weeks, like generally. We can brew a batch of yeast within a couple days, within a week therein. And once we do more optimization work, we really expect to see yields increase and production time decrease. So the speed is one thing. Another thing that really gets us excited is the safety. Yeast is a very safe organism to work with. Luke, I don't know, have you ever made bread before?
Yeah, my friends, I was just hanging out with Tim Pool and other individuals, and they just got a bread machine. It was like we were there the whole time I was there. We were just standing in front of the bread because it was smelling so good. I just a confession there, and yeah, it's something that millennials are discovering as we're under house arrest, and a lot of people are easily entertained by that.
Yes. So if you've ever baked bread, you'd probably agree that yeast is pretty safe. So the speed of production and the potential speed of production is super interesting, and then the safety of working with yeast is very encouraging as well. So that's why we've chosen it as a production platform, and we'll be continuing to develop other biosynthesis strategies as we go.
Now, you do a lot of this kind of development in a facility in the British Virgin Islands. Is there a reason you're doing it there? Is there some kind of like legal loophole or tax loophole? Like,
no loopholes. No loopholes. No, it's nothing like that. For clarity, I'm in British Columbia. The operating portion of Pharmadelic is based here in Victoria, on Vancouver Island. And the purpose of Pharmadelic is to develop IP. So it's not about production so much as the strategies for production that we work on. So it's the intellectual property that Pharmadelic produces. We're looking to partner with other companies and other facilities through the portfolio of companies under TheraMed in jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands, which allow for work with psilocybin. It's not illegal to work with psilocybin. And in fact, I believe Jamaica as well actually never made it illegal to start with. So this is great because it allows us to employ the IP we've developed and are developing here in Canada in a jurisdiction that allows us to actually use it. So we do the IP development in Canada, then we can bring it down to a jurisdiction like the British Virgin Islands or like Jamaica, where it's not illegal to actually do it, and we can take it a step further and continue the intellectual property development and continue the research without having to wait for the regulators to catch up for the rest of North America.
Maybe I'll even come and visit. This sounds really fascinating, really interesting. I've been to the British Virgin Islands before. Had crazy adventures down there, to say the least. But George, thank you so much for joining us and being a part of the show and sharing so much of this wealth of information from inside of this very important field that's growing and expanding. Where can people find out more information about you? Where can people join you? And where are you going in the next year?
Sure. Okay. So anyone that's interested, I'd really encourage them to check out the TheraMed website. We have some information on our portfolio companies and some information on the company and where we come from and all that. If they have questions, anyone that has questions can reach out to the IR department. The contact information should be on the website. And if there's any questions from or inquiries or interest from institutions, they can reach out to me through the IR department. My name is George Anstey, so any institutions out there that have questions, they can get me through the IR. And in terms of moving forward, TheraMed is looking to develop a balanced portfolio of assets within the within the psychedelic space as it applies to pharmaceuticals, and looking to interface ultimately with pharmaceutical interests. So we're building it, and there will be more to see next year too.
George, thank you so much for joining us and sharing a lot of this information from inside of this very important field that, of course, had to be underground for a while. It's good seeing it come above ground, become more legitimate, become more legal, and become something that has effectively the possibility of helping a lot of people. George, thank you again so much for joining us. I hope you guys enjoyed that. If you did, share it with your friends and family members, and of course, stay tuned for more here on wearechange.org.